Daniel Whitmore was a man people in town admired from a distance, but feared up close. At 48, he had built one of the most successful real estate companies in the state. His picture-perfect life was displayed through the car he drove, a black Mercedes that glistened like polished glass under the sun, and the sharp, custom suits that fit him like armor. He moved through the world with a presence that said, "I don't need anyone." Yet behind the image was a very different reality. Daniel lived in a penthouse suite, high above the city, but his home was quiet, too quiet. His wife, tired of his coldness and obsession with money, had left years earlier. His daughter, Emily, now 17, rarely spoke to him, and when she did, it was short and strained. The truth was, Daniel had convinced himself that he didn't need family or friends. Business was his comfort. Deals, contracts, and numbers filled the silence he had created. But deep down, when the office lights dimmed and the world stopped buzzing, the loneliness pressed on him like a weight he couldn't shake. One chilly Tuesday morning, as Daniel stepped out of his sleek office building, he noticed a young man across the street. The boy couldn't have been older than 20. He wore a hoodie with frayed cuffs, jeans that had seen better days, and sneakers with soles peeling off. He was carrying a stack of boxes that looked far too heavy for him, stumbling as he tried to balance them. He paused in front of Daniel's building, panting, his face flushed with effort. The young man glanced at Daniel and managed, "Sir, could you?" But before he could finish, Daniel raised a hand and snapped, "Not my problem." He didn't even slow his stride. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he headed straight to his waiting car. The boy's eyes followed him, disappointment flashing across his face, but Daniel didn't look back. He climbed into his Mercedes, shut the door, and drove off, leaving the young man standing there with his boxes. What Daniel didn't realize was that his dismissive words that morning weren't the end of the story. They were the beginning, because life has a way of circling back, forcing us to face what we try hardest to avoid. And soon, Daniel would find himself on the receiving end of an act of kindness so disarming, so unexpected, that it would crack open the walls he had built for decades. And the way it happened, Daniel never could have seen it coming. The week dragged on, and Daniel poured himself deeper into work. Deadlines, conference calls, investor meetings, they all blended into a blur. He barely slept, and when he did, it was restless. His apartment felt emptier than ever. He'd heat up a frozen meal, stare at his phone for hours, and go to bed with the sound of the city outside his window, but no voices inside. Then came Thursday night. Daniel sat in his office, the city skyline glowing through the glass walls. Papers were scattered across his desk, his tie loosened, his head throbbing from the stress of a deal that was falling apart. His investors wanted answers. His competitors were circling. And for the first time, Daniel felt the ground beneath him start to shake. He rubbed his temple, trying to focus, when a sharp pain spread across his chest. He leaned back in his chair, breathing hard. The room tilted, his vision dimmed. He tried to reach for his phone, but his hand slipped. A second later, he collapsed forward, his head hitting the edge of his desk. When Daniel slowly opened his eyes, the world was blurry. His heart pounded. And standing over him was a face he barely recognized. A young employee, one of the new hires he'd barely acknowledged during meetings. His name tag read Ethan. Ethan's voice trembled, but his hands were steady as he supported Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore, just stay with me. I've already called 911. Daniel groaned, disoriented. I'm fine. I don't need," but Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, sir. You need help. Please, don't talk." Within minutes, paramedics rushed into the office. Ethan stayed by Daniel's side the entire time, even climbing into the ambulance with him. Daniel wanted to protest, to push him away, but his strength was gone. Hours later, after the doctors had stabilized him and confirmed it was a stress-induced collapse, Daniel sat in a hospital bed, silent. He was stunned. Ethan had stayed in the waiting room the entire time. A kid he barely knew, a kid he had probably dismissed countless times, had dropped everything to help him. As Daniel watched Ethan walk into the room with a worried look and a cup of water, something inside him shifted. He had been shown kindness he didn't deserve, kindness he had never offered to others. And that undeserved kindness began to stir memories Daniel had spent years trying to bury. But those memories, they weren't easy ones. And once they resurfaced, Daniel would have no choice but to confront them. Daniel sat in the hospital bed, the steady beep of the monitor filling the silence. The doctor had already explained what had happened: a stress-induced collapse, a warning sign that his body couldn't keep carrying the weight he was forcing on it. Daniel nodded at the doctor's words, but his mind wasn't on the diagnosis. It was on Ethan. That boy, that employee whose name he had barely remembered, had stayed with him through everything. Ethan didn't owe him a thing. Daniel had been cold, dismissive, even rude to him during past meetings. And yet, when Daniel needed someone most, Ethan had shown up without hesitation. That undeserved kindness unsettled him. It stirred something inside, something he hadn't felt in years. As he lay back against the stiff hospital pillow, images began to creep into his mind. Memories. Old ones. The kind he had buried under years of work and ambition. He tried to push them away, but the more he resisted, the sharper they became. He saw himself 20 years younger, standing in a small apartment kitchen. Back then, he wasn't the polished businessman people saw today. He was just Daniel, a struggling man in his late 20s, full of ambition but short on patience. And across from him stood his younger brother, Mark. Mark had always been the opposite of Daniel. Where Daniel was sharp and driven, Mark was gentle and kind. He worked a modest job at a hardware store, and even though he didn't make much, he was always helping neighbors, volunteering, or giving away what little he had. Daniel had often mocked him for it. But the memory that now clawed at him was of one particular night. Mark had come to him desperate. Their mother had fallen ill, and the hospital bills were mounting. Mark begged Daniel for help. "Please, Dan," Mark's voice echoed in Daniel's head, trembling but hopeful. "She needs this. I can't cover it all by myself. You've got the means. You've got the connections. Just help me this once." Daniel remembered the way he had stood there, arms crossed, his jaw set. "I don't have time for this, Mark. I've got deals on the line. I can't keep throwing money into problems that never end." Mark's face had fallen, but he had still tried to smile. "You're my brother. You're all I've got. I'm not asking for me, I'm asking for Mom." But Daniel turned away. He walked out that night, leaving Mark to carry the weight alone. Within months, their mother passed. And instead of being there for his brother, Daniel buried himself in his career, telling himself that success would justify everything. That money would make the guilt disappear. Now, lying in that hospital bed, Ethan's kindness replayed in his mind, overlapping with the memory of Mark's pleading eyes. The way Ethan stayed, even though Daniel had given him no reason to, mirrored the way Mark had once stayed by his side, forgiving his coldness, believing the best in him. Daniel clenched his fists against the blanket. He hadn't spoken to Mark in over 15 years. After their mother's death, their relationship crumbled. He had chosen pride over reconciliation. And the truth was, he had avoided reaching out all these years because he couldn't face the shame of what he had done. But now, Ethan's kindness made the memory impossible to ignore. It was as if the universe was holding up a mirror, showing him the man he had become. A man who had turned his back on kindness, on family, on love. Daniel's chest tightened again, though not from stress this time. From guilt. From regret. And deep down, he knew he could only run from the truth for so long. Because the more he tried to bury it, the louder the past was becoming, and soon, it would be impossible to ignore. When Daniel was discharged from the hospital a couple of days later, he walked out of those sliding doors determined to shake off the storm that had begun inside him. The doctor's words were still echoing. "Your body can't keep living under this kind of pressure. If you don't make changes, next time might be worse." But Daniel did what he had always done: bury it, pretend it wasn't happening. He convinced himself that if he went right back to work, if he just powered through the uneasy feelings, the guilt, the memories of Mark, they'd all fade like they had so many times before. The very next morning, Daniel was back in his office. His assistant had tried to suggest taking a few days off, but he waved her off with a curt, "I don't take breaks." He dove straight into phone calls, contracts, and negotiations. He barked orders, interrupted people mid-sentence, and carried himself with that same hardened exterior that had built his reputation. On the outside, it looked like Daniel was back to business as usual. But the truth was he wasn't. Because now, every small act of kindness he witnessed seemed to strike him like lightning. When the janitor held the door open for an elderly woman in the lobby, Daniel froze for a second longer than he should have. When his assistant brought him coffee without him asking, he caught himself staring at the cup, remembering the time Mark used to do the same thing for him when they were younger. When Ethan passed by his office and gave him a polite smile, Daniel's chest tightened, because all he could see was Mark's forgiving face in that tiny apartment decades ago. And yet, Daniel fought it. He told himself he didn't need to go back to the past. He told himself that dredging up old regrets would only slow him down. He told himself that Mark probably didn't care anymore anyway, that too much time had passed. But the more he pushed the memories down, the more they clawed their way back up. One evening, he stopped by a diner near his apartment, something he hadn't done in years. He usually ordered takeout or had food delivered, but that night, something compelled him to sit at a booth. Across from him, a young family sat together, a father, a mother, and a little boy. Daniel didn't mean to stare, but he couldn't look away. The boy spilled his drink, and instead of snapping, the father chuckled, ruffled his son's hair, and said, "It's okay, buddy. We'll clean it up." That simple display of patience and love hit Daniel like a punch in the gut. He thought of Emily, his own daughter, and how he hadn't spoken to her in weeks. Even when he did, their conversations were cold and transactional. "Do you need money for school? Did you finish your homework?" Never once had he sat with her the way that father was sitting with his son, showing grace in a mistake. Daniel's appetite disappeared. He left the diner early, driving home with the image of that family burned into his mind. But when he got home, the silence of his apartment wrapped around him like a punishment. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, scrolling to his brother Mark's number, a number he hadn't dialed in years. His finger hovered over the call button, his throat tight. But pride won again. With a heavy sigh, he put the phone down and muttered to himself, "It's too late. He doesn't want to hear from me." The next day, he buried himself deeper into work. But it was becoming harder and harder to keep the walls up. Every hallway conversation, every random smile, every undeserved kindness, they were all cracks forming in the fortress he had built. Daniel was beginning to realize that no matter how much he resisted, no matter how hard he tried to deny it, the truth was circling closer and closer. The guilt wasn't going away. The memories weren't fading. And deep inside, he knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. Because eventually, Daniel would be forced to confront the very person he had been avoiding all these years, and that confrontation would change everything. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Daniel had spent the morning trying to drown himself in work, even though it was the weekend. Contracts were spread out across his kitchen table, but his eyes weren't on the papers. They were on his phone. 4 hours he'd been staring at one name in his contacts, Mark Whitmore. The guilt had been gnawing at him all week, every hour heavier than the last. Ethan's kindness, the memories of his mother's illness, the way he'd walked away from his brother when he needed him most, it all pressed on him like a weight he could no longer carry. He finally realized that no amount of money, no shiny car, no corporate success was enough to silence the voice inside that whispered, "You abandoned him." His hands trembled as he picked up the phone. For a long moment, he just sat there, thumb hovering over the call button. "He's not going to answer," he whispered to himself. "And even if he does, he won't want to hear from me." But with a deep breath, Daniel pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as he was about to hang up, a voice came through. "Hello." Daniel's chest tightened. It was Mark. Older now, his tone heavier, but unmistakable. There was a long pause before Daniel spoke. His voice cracked. "Mark, it's me. It's Daniel." Silence on the other end. For a moment, Daniel thought he'd been hung up on. Then Mark spoke again, cautious but steady. "I know who it is. What do you want, Daniel?" The words stung, but Daniel knew he deserved them. He swallowed hard. "I need to see you. Please, just give me a chance to talk." After another long pause, Mark sighed. Fine. Tomorrow. At Dad's old place. 3 o'clock. Then the line went dead. The next day, Daniel drove to their childhood home, a modest one-story house on the edge of town. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Memories flooded back as he pulled into the cracked driveway, playing catch in the yard, his mother calling them in for dinner, arguments that escalated into silence. Mark was already there, sitting on the porch steps. His hair was grayer now, his face lined with years of wear. He didn't get up when Daniel approached. He just watched him, guarded. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his voice low. I don't even know where to start. Mark shook his head. Start with the truth. You owe me that much. Daniel's throat tightened. For the first time in decades, he let himself be vulnerable. I left you. I left Mom. I cared more about chasing success than being there when you needed me. And I've told myself for years that it was too late, that you wouldn't forgive me. But the truth is, I've been running from the shame. Every time I think about it, I feel like I can't breathe. His eyes brimmed with tears. I'm sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry. The words hung in the air, raw and heavy. Daniel's chest heaved, waiting for the explosion of anger he knew was coming. But it didn't. Instead, Mark let out a slow breath. His voice was softer now, though still edged with pain. Do you think I haven't replayed that night 1,000 times? Do you think I don't remember begging you for help, only to watch you walk out the door? It broke me, Daniel. It broke us. But... He paused, his eyes glistening. You're still my brother. And I've held on to bitterness for too long. Maybe it's time I let it go. Daniel blinked, stunned. You're not angry? Mark gave a small, weary smile. I am. But anger doesn't heal anything. Forgiveness does. And I think Mom would want me to forgive you. In that moment, Daniel's walls finally crumbled. His pride, his defenses, his carefully crafted image, they all shattered as he fell to his knees on the porch, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, Mark, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you. Mark reached out, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift. But forgiveness was only the beginning. What Daniel did next would prove whether he was truly ready to change, or whether old habits would win again. After that day on the porch, Daniel drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past his windshield, but his mind wasn't on the road. It was on Mark's words. Forgiveness. A chance to start again. For years, he had convinced himself there would never be such a chance, that the bridge was burned beyond repair. Yet here he was, holding on to something he hadn't felt in decades, hope. But Daniel also knew forgiveness didn't erase the past. It was only the doorway to a different future. The real test was whether he would walk through it. The first step came sooner than he expected. A few days later, Daniel sat in his office staring at a picture of his daughter, Emily. It had been sitting on his desk for years, but he'd never really looked at it. In the photo, Emily was 8 years old, smiling in a pink dress at her school recital. Now she was 17, nearly an adult, and he had missed so much of her life. The milestones, the quiet moments, the chances to be more than just the man who paid the bills. His hands shook as he picked up the phone. Emily answered after a long pause, her voice cautious. Dad. Daniel cleared his throat. Hi, sweetheart. I was wondering if we could have dinner. Just the two of us. I want to talk. I want to listen. There was silence. For a moment, Daniel thought she might say no. Then Emily sighed. But just dinner. No lectures. When they met later that week, Daniel made a conscious choice. No phone, no business talk, no distractions. Just his daughter. They sat at a small Italian restaurant, the kind Emily liked. At first, she was quiet, giving him short answers. But Daniel didn't push. He asked about her classes, her friends, her dreams. He admitted he hadn't been there like he should have. He told her he wanted to do better. Slowly, her guard began to lower. For the first time in years, they laughed together. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. At work, too, Daniel began to change. He noticed the people around him more. When his assistant brought him coffee, he didn't just take it. He thanked her, asked how her morning was going. When Ethan passed by, Daniel stopped him. "I owe you more than I can say," he admitted. "You showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. Don't think I'll forget that." Ethan smiled, surprised, and for the first time, Daniel felt what it meant to value someone not for what they could do for him, but for who they were. Even small gestures, holding the elevator for a stranger, giving his driver an extra tip with a genuine thank you, making eye contact, and smiling at people in the lobby, began to soften the cold reputation he had built. People noticed. The atmosphere in his office shifted. Employees who had once feared him began to feel comfortable approaching him. Most importantly, Daniel didn't stop with words. He took action. He reached out to Mark again, not just to say sorry, but to show up. One Saturday, he drove to Mark's house with groceries, insisting they cook together like they used to when they were boys. Another time, he accompanied Mark to visit their mother's grave, kneeling beside him in silence, finally allowing himself to grieve openly. For the first time in decades, Daniel wasn't running from his past. He was facing it head-on, step by step. And with every step, the burden on his chest grew lighter. But the most profound change wasn't in what others saw, it was in what Daniel felt. He no longer woke up with the same emptiness. Instead of drowning in contracts and deals, he began to seek out moments of connection. Breakfast with Emily, weekly calls with Mark, even joining a local community project his company sponsored. Kindness had cracked him open, and now it flowed out of him in ways he'd never thought possible. Still, Daniel knew this was just the beginning. Forgiveness had been given, bridges were being rebuilt, but the deeper lesson was one he carried everywhere now. Because what Daniel came to understand was that kindness doesn't just change how others see you, it forces you to confront who you really are. And the truth he had avoided for so long was about to reveal the most powerful lesson of all. Months passed, and Daniel's life looked very different from the one he had known before that night in the hospital. The sharp edges of his personality had softened. He still ran his company, but people noticed something new about him. He wasn't just respected anymore, he was approachable. His employees no longer whispered nervously when he walked by, they smiled. He learned their names, asked about their families, and even started hosting small gatherings where the focus wasn't business, but people. At home, the change was even more profound. Emily, once distant and guarded, began spending more time with him. They cooked dinner together, shared walks through the park, and even started a Saturday tradition of grabbing coffee at her favorite cafe. For years, Daniel had believed money was the only way to show love. But now, he understood that love was presence, patience, and listening. And Emily noticed the difference. One evening, as they walked out of the cafe, she slipped her arm through his and whispered, "I'm glad you're trying, Dad." For Daniel, those words meant more than any business deal he'd ever closed. His relationship with Mark also deepened. It wasn't easy, years of hurt don't disappear overnight. But little by little, the bond of brotherhood began to heal. They sat together at family dinners, visited their mother's grave on holidays, and even started repairing their father's old house side by side. Each hammer strike, each brush of paint, became a small step toward rebuilding not just the house, but their connection. Through it all, Daniel carried with him the truth that had once haunted him but now set him free. He had spent decades running from guilt, hiding behind success, and shutting out kindness. And yet, one simple act, a young employee staying by his side in his weakest moment, had shattered that illusion. Because kindness has a power that nothing else does. It doesn't just heal wounds, it forces us to face ourselves. It holds up a mirror to the parts of us we'd rather keep hidden and says, "This is who you are. Now who do you want to be?" Daniel learned that kindness isn't about deserving or earning. It's about giving without expecting anything in return. Ethan had shown him that. Mark had reminded him of it. Emily had begun to receive it from him. And in giving it back to others, Daniel had discovered something he never thought he would. Peace. The man who once dismissed a struggling stranger on the street was now the man who stopped to help. The father who once spoke to his daughter like she was just another obligation was now the dad who cherished every moment with her. The brother who once abandoned family was now rebuilding it, brick by brick. And so, Daniel's story leaves us with this. Sometimes, it only takes a single act of kindness to break through the walls we've built around our hearts. Kindness doesn't just change the person who receives it. It changes the one who gives it. It forces us to face the truths we've buried and gives us the courage to choose differently. Daniel spent half his life running from the truth. But when kindness caught up to him, he finally understood, facing the truth isn't what breaks us. It's what sets us free. And maybe, just maybe, that's a reminder for all of us. The kindness we choose today could be the very thing that saves someone else tomorrow. Moral of this story: sometimes, it takes just one act of kindness to open our eyes to the truth we've been running from. Kindness has the power not only to heal others but to heal us, to strip away our pride, confront our regrets, and set us free to become better versions of ourselves. Daniel learned that when he finally faced his past, he gained back something more valuable than success: family, forgiveness, and peace. So if you're holding back kindness today, thinking it won't matter, think again. The smallest gesture can change a life, maybe even your own. Be the reason someone believes in forgiveness, in hope, in love. Because when you lead with kindness, you don't just change the world around you, you change yourself. And remember, we're not just telling stories. We're changing lives.